I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. You may have noticed that the Electorette has been on a bit of a hiatus, and that's because I'm ramping up for the next season, which will air in a few weeks sometime this spring. But I'm breaking that hiatus today because I had an opportunity to have a conversation with a very brilliant person. Today's guest, Kimberly St Julian-Varnon, is a PhD student in Soviet Russian and Eastern European history at the University of Pennsylvania, and Kimberly is also an expert on Russia and Ukraine. Kimberly wrote an essay earlier this month breaking down some of the fallacies in how we talk about Russia's aggressive tactics directed towards Ukraine. In particular, Kimberly's essay focuses on a statement released by the Progressive Caucus and corrects some of the talking points which she asserts could be dangerous for Ukraine. My conversation with Kimberly focuses on how the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is both perceived and discussed within the US, because those debates will shape public opinion. And of course, they'll shape our political climate and may shape how the administration responds to this crisis. We talk about a lot in this episode because Kimberly, of course, is an expert, and I had a lot of questions. So buckle up and take a listen to my conversation with Kimberly St Julian-Varnon. Kimberly St Julian-Varnon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So before we get into what's happening right now with Russia, specifically, I want to talk to you about Putin's address yesterday. But I want to start by talking about how this conflict is being perceived and debated here in the U.S. Because you wrote an essay titled Ice Cream Diplomacy, and I love that title. And that essay was in response to a statement released by the Progressive Caucus within the Democratic Party. So the Progressive Caucus, it has members like, Representative Barbara Lee, Pramila Jayapal, who is my representative here in Washington State. So anyway, the statement was addressing the Biden administration's response to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So that is what your essay was about. Why did you think it was important to write that essay?
I think it was important because I realized that the framing of the conflict wasn't just like incorrect. I thought it could be dangerous for Ukraine. I've done research in Ukraine. I've lived in Kiev and Odessa. And I worried that this narrative of somehow the United States and our military industrial complex having an interest in war in Ukraine versus Putin's neo-imperialist ideas being the cause of this conflict. Like, it needed to be corrected and needed to be corrected immediately for the sake of Ukraine, but also for the sake of the United States involvement in this, international crisis that has ramped up considerably since I wrote the essay.
I read the statement when it came out, and I, didn't agree with a lot of the assertions that they made, but I just kind of dismissed it as, one person's or one group of people, their opinion. I didn't see it necessarily as dangerous to Ukraine until I read your essay. So how is it specifically dangerous, do you think?
I think the key part of why it could be seen as dangerous is, and it was something I started to notice on social media, especially, is this narrative of there is no actual threat to Ukraine, but it's the media wanting a war. And I started seeing like people with thousands of Twitter followers kind of replicating this narrative. And I worried about the fact that, our unelected officials, they are responsible and responsive to their constituents. And so if this is a popular opinion among their constituents, it could definitely influence the responses of our elected officials in the House and in the Senate and how they're going to respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine. I also wanted to kind of confront this messaging because, I'm generally a fan of progressive politics and the Progressive Caucus. And so I was really struck by how, I would argue, how short-sighted this was to understand this conflict. But also I worry about alienating the very large Ukrainian diaspora community that lives in the United States who still have friends and family in Ukraine. And I worry about the impact that this could have on our foreign policy in general. And like, I support diplomacy, but it's also, I'm a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So I also understand the limits to straight negotiation, diplomacy, and the need for, using things like sanctions to get the ball rolling, but also to help keep and protect the sovereignty of smaller countries like Ukraine.
Right. And I want to state, too, that I am, I do support the Progressive Caucus, especially Representative Barbara Lee, who I've interviewed before. And so I was struck a little bit about, the statement or the release and, how many assertions I didn't necessarily agree with. But, that's fine. But I just want to kind of go through some of the talking points from the statement. It was fairly short, and I'll put it in the show notes. But just starting off with, they said something to the effect of Russia's strategy is to inflame tensions and the US must not play into that. And just starting there, I thought, well, their strategy isn't just to inflame tensions, right? Because that sounds
Mhm.
rather passive. Like their intention, I think, is to invade. Is that fair?
Yes, that's definitely fair. And it's helped by hindsight now because that's literally what's happening. But if Russia's intention was just to inflame, like Russia could have done that without putting 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border,
Exactly.
right? Russia has been inflaming domestic problems in Ukraine since, late 2013. So I think that was the first thing where I was like, okay, this is not what's happening on the ground. This is not what's happening and my friends in Ukraine are talking about right now. So I think that really undercut the seriousness of the situation. And I think that was a key concern for me. Is like, this is more serious than, the way it's being framed. This isn't just Russia being a troll. This is Russia being a militarily aggressive country.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess I was struck by that because, admittedly, I'm no foreign policy expert, not by a long shot. And but it doesn't take a lot to just look back to 2014 to see that their intention isn't just to inflame tensions, right? If our electeds were to buy into this idea of not buying into it, not buying into the idea that they're trying to inflame tensions, I'm not really sure what that means, what that phrase means, that we shouldn't buy into it. Are they suggesting that the US and NATO not intervene in the takeover or the attempted takeover of this, sovereign nation? That's the only thing I can take from it.
Yeah, and I think this is a key thing, like you see throughout this narrative, that's become very popular on the left, is that NATO is like an imperialist organization, and somehow Ukraine joining NATO to protect its autonomy and its sovereignty is somehow imperialist. But Russia is the one who's engaging in neo imperialism and violating and has continued to violate the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, which is why Ukraine has been interested in NATO membership. But it's also the wrong framing. Using NATO allows Putin to frame his behavior, and that's not what this was about. And as we've seen in the past 48 hours, NATO made a very small mention in his discussion of why he recognized Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics as independent entities. Um, so I think the NATO idea, like Putin used this as a ploy. Ukraine has not really been seriously considering NATO, and NATO has not seriously considered adding Ukraine. This would be a years long process. So this is not on the horizon. And like this, and to buy that argument is to give Putin way too much credit and to really buy into his framing of the situation, which is, as we've seen now, which was it was a lie. He wasn't worried about NATO.
I want to ask you about that because I'm not really sure what the status is of their entry into NATO. I didn't know that they're being considered, but I thought that it was closer than it actually is, apparently. Ukraine.
I mean, I've seen numbers like 8 to 10 years
Wow.
for
Okay.
Ukraine to enter NATO. So yeah, this is not happening in the next 6 months, the next 2 years. This was a very long, drawn out process. And it's kind of the same thing with Ukraine attempting to join the European Union. So these are years long processes that Ukraine has to go through, which are hobbled by the fact that Eastern Ukraine, occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, are destable. And so the way that Putin discussed NATO, it makes it seem like he's very concerned that Ukraine's joining NATO next week, and he's doing this as a defense measure when that's not the case. And it has not been the case. It wasn't the case. It isn't the case in 2022, and it wasn't the case in 2014 when we saw the Russian incursion into the East and its annexation of Crimea. So we have to really think about what Putin is saying versus the way he's behaving on the ground and what he says in Russian media versus what he's saying in meetings with Biden and Macron and Schultz, when at NATO and EU conferences.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to clear that up. But I just want to go back to the statement for a little bit, and then we'll go on to what's happening on the ground in Russia right now, in Ukraine. So another part of the statement with the Progressive Caucus, or the statement from the Progressive Caucus, rather, they said that there is no military solution and diplomacy needs to be the focus. And I am hoping you can help me unpack that because, of course, diplomacy needs to be the focus. And it has been, I'm pretty sure, for the specific conflict since 2014. So I'm not really sure what to make of that, right?
Mhm.
What the ask is there.
Definitely. And I think that was also when I read it, I was like, but do you know who Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is? Like this,
Right.
the diplomacy is great, but I mean, at the end of the day, this is Putin's decision, how Putin is going to behave. And we have seen, like, since this memorandum has come out, like Putin has engaged with high level conversations with Macron and Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor of Germany. He's made promises to them, and then he's reneged on those promises literally 48 hours after he made them. Right.
Right,
So
right.
I think Putin's behavior shows there an incredibly strong limit to the success of negotiation based diplomacy. And I think the key issue here is it ignores what happened in 2014. We tried, diplomacy. We ended up having sanctions on Russia, but Crimea was still annexed, and Russian pro-Russian forces have still been causing havoc for the past 8 years in occupied Donbass, and now they've been recognized as independent. And Russian troops are, are basing themselves in this newly independent territory. So the question is, what more can diplomacy do when the other party in the negotiations has already shown that they are not interested in diplomacy?
Right.
It's just like when we think about the military option and this concern, it wasn't just the Progressive Caucus that voiced this concern, but it's all over the internet. The United States, who just got out of the Afghan war, and we're going to get into another war. And the Biden administration has made it exceedingly clear that there will be no American troops fighting in Ukraine. In fact, the few hundred we had in Western Ukraine who were helped to train Ukrainian forces, those troops have been removed to Poland. There are no American troops in Ukraine. So it's like, what exactly is this concern about military use, when everything the Biden administration has done has shown that they have no interest in a United States led or involved military solution to this problem?
Right. And you're right. It isn't just the Progressive Caucus who have, voiced these concerns, right? But these things have a tendency to bleed out, right? When you have some very
Hmm.
influential members and they have lots of followers and, like I said, they're very
Hmm.
influential, it does bleed out and it becomes, the lines become blurry, right? Like whose opinion is this, right? So that's concerning.
Oh yeah.
The last part of their statement, ends with referencing past crises, where there hasn't been clear intelligence. And I know exactly
Hmm.
what that's in reference to. It's in reference to Iraq. And I remember, Representative
Hmm.
Barbara Lee, she had a very memorable and public stance against that. And she happened to be right in that instance, but I'm not sure
Hmm.
that the comparison is fair.
Oh, it's completely unfair, and I said this in my
In
in
your
my
essay.
piece. Like, yeah, like Ukraine in 2022 is not Iraq in 2003. And it's also like, to say that, to try to juxtapose Ukraine in 2022 and Iraq in 2003, is to be fundamentally unaware of the situation on the ground in Ukraine from 2014 to now. Um, and admittedly, like, we did have problems with our intelligence, in the Iraq War. But I mean, we have satellite imagery of the Russian buildup, and we've had this information since late November, or actually early November. The United States started raising the alarm, and the EU, joined in on that. So I think you have to be very careful when you take domestic political talking points and try to apply them to new international crises, and understand that the context of those situations are fundamentally different. And so our thinking needs to be fundamentally different.
Right, right. And the last assertion that was made actually was not a part of the statement, but made later by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in an interview where she mentioned the military-industrial complex. And I think, and she hasn't been the only person who said that, but I think that that claim is about asserting that our interest in Ukraine is, profit driven, right? There's a
Hmm.
profit motive, a military profit motive behind NATO's intervention or NATO stance and America's stance. Am I reading that right?
That's how I read it.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think, and it's, once again, it goes back to that framing of Iraq. Like, this isn't Halliburton. And Ukraine is not the major oil and gas producer. Russia is the major oil and gas producer. So following that logic, we would be invading Russia. We wouldn't be supporting Ukraine. No one's talking about invading Russia. So yeah, it just wasn't, the context is different. So you can't think that way. And I think it shows a lack of imagination to understanding America's role in, like, these type of crises, but also our foreign policy, to just kind of constantly juxtapose, the war we admittedly just got out of with this crisis that's happening now. And we can't lack imagination when it comes to American foreign policy, because Putin clearly has a very good imagination in the way he sees the world.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I just I'm trying to figure out how to put this delicately. I just don't know how we end up here when this information is there. And it is really concerning because I think one of the points that you make in the essay is that these points made in the statement were repeating Russian talking points. And I don't know how that happened. So I'm not really sure how we get from, what's factual, even for me, and I'm not a foreign policy expert, and by a long shot, to, repeating these Russian talking points. I mean, how?
Oh, I gotta be honest here. I think, like, I love AOC, and I think that when you are just because you are strong on domestic policy issues does not mean you are strong on foreign policy. And I think this isn't just a problem of AOC. I think this is a problem for many members of Congress, who have very good and interesting ideas on portfolios in the domestic political sphere, but those do not translate well into foreign policy. And I think another problem is, like, our Congress people are often overwhelmed and they're getting the 1 or 2 page executive summaries of things, which is also why we need to rely on experts who know what they're talking about and trust that the people we hire for their expertise can do their jobs, right? And so I think, if anything, this means, as a few members of the Progressive Caucus, you need to look to and improve your foreign policy teams, because, like, this is just a dangerous place to mess up. And I think, in the midterms, if I can definitely see the Republicans using what's happening in Ukraine against them. Like, this is it's a foreign policy short sightedness you just cannot have right now.
Right. And if Democrats are going to go into November with a unified message, right, this cannot be the message. And,
Yeah,
off the bat, it has to be factual, right? I mean,
yeah.
let's just start there. It has to be factual. I have great respect for all of them. I just think that I'm not really sure why the media does not, pose these questions to the foreign policy experts, right? They seem to be
hmm
kind of starstruck and they want to, have these interviews with people who may not have the foreign policy expertise, but they would just rather have the interview. I'm not really sure what the motive is there, but that doesn't mean that they don't have expertise in other places. It's just that, yeah, this is very complex and it's a very naughty problem. Like naughty as in KNOTTY, not naughty. although Putin is very naughty. But anyway, a naughty problem. You get it.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think it's also kind of been exasperating, because I know so many people who are experts on Ukraine, on Russia, and they're not being interviewed. They aren't being called on to talk about these issues. But people who have very little experience, who can't read Ukrainian or Russian, they're giving their opinions about it because they know how to speak in, like, talking points and, like, SEO keywords. So I think
Yeah.
that's also, like, an issue, is, like, you have to get the base to, you have to get a good audience to listen to your podcast or to tune into the news or to read your articles. And that isn't necessarily a skill a lot of academics have. So that's a problem we have to work on. But it's definitely a good time to give space to the people who've dedicated their lives to this.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you have the answer to this, and I'll just pose it again. But like, how do you end up with members of Congress, not parroting necessarily, but repeating statements that are favorable to Russia, right? I'm not saying
Mhm.
it's deliberate, but like, how does it happen?
Like, Russian disinformation, especially on Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine and about the Ukrainian government. They've had years to develop this. I mean, a lot of the messaging we've seen about Zelensky since he became president, Putin has just recycled from 2014 about various Ukrainian presidents. So I think it's also important to think, who does this viewpoint help? So when it comes down to NATO, and thinking about, okay, when did NATO enter this conversation? NATO entered this conversation because Putin placed NATO into the conversation, right? So I think it's really about, you have to think clearly, and this takes longer than a few minutes to kind of sit and read and process information. But luckily, we have thousands of graduate students and PhDs whose job is exactly to do that. And I just, coming from recognizing the time and the demands on the time of people in Congress. I think this is really why you have to trust your foreign policy teams, because this is their job. This is what they should be doing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go on to actually what's happening right now. And it's hard to, discuss this because things are moving so quickly, right?
Hmm.
Putin did an address just the other day where he made a claim to recognizing these two Moscow-backed regions
Hmm.
within Ukraine. And I think that that was intended to be a pretext for invasion, the pretext that everyone's been anticipating but didn't know what it would be. Is that correct or no?
Oh yeah, I'd agree. It's the pretext I've been concerned about, and I know a lot of people who follow Ukraine have been concerned about, that acknowledging these two regions as independent would then allow Putin to say he's giving them military aid, which is exactly what happened. So this is the pretext I think that we've kind of been discussing in the national news for the past couple of weeks. Although you do have the problem where if you keep saying invasion's imminent, like every 24 hours, people get exhausted, the news cycle gets exhausted. And so you're in the situation of the boy who cried wolf, right? You keep saying invasion's coming. So when invasion finally does come, a lot of people are underwhelmed, So I have been concerned about that, especially now things are moving so quickly. We still don't know the extent to which Russia will be, moving its military into Ukraine.
So just help me understand what that meant exactly. So these two regions are somewhere within Ukraine. So does this give Putin and the Russian army access, like physical access? Like what does it mean?
Like it's hard to visualize if you don't have a map. So I'm trying to figure out like how
Yeah.
to okay. So if you think about Ukraine, Kiev, the capital, is in the middle, right? So it's in the middle of Ukraine on this river called the Dnipro River. And so to the east of that river is where you have Kharkiv, which is another major metropolitan industrial city in Ukraine. And this has also kind of been brought up in some security circles as a point of invasion. So Luhansk and Donetsk are they're cities, but they're also the names of the big regions, and they're in the far east of Ukraine. So they're on the Russian-Ukrainian border. So within these two big regions, you have probably about half of that region, of the Luhansk region and the Donetsk region. Those are occupied by pro-Russian forces. So these are the two areas that Putin has said and has recognized as independent, and he will be giving them military aid. Now, this is where things get tricky. So, in his most recent address, I believe it was this morning, USA time, he said that they would only place Russian military up to the point, that these two regions recognize their borders, which is word salad. I know it's word salad. It was word salad when I said it. It was word salad in Russian when Putin said it. So this is the problem. We don't know exactly how the leaders of Luhansk and Donetsk, what they see their borders as. So in this case, you can see a situation where Russian military will be fighting and going into Ukrainian controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. And if this happens, this is about half of eastern Ukraine that is up for grabs at this point. So this is huge. And the another idea that I've seen is that Putin will use these two occupied regions as a base to further attack areas like Kharkiv, that big city, Mariupol, which is a city near the Sea of Azov in southeastern Ukraine, and perhaps Kiev. So these are kind of the different scenarios because he already controls Crimea. So if he controls Mariupol, he controls Crimea and Mykolaiv, which is also it's southern, like the middle of southern Ukraine, and that way he can kind of isolate Kiev from Western Ukraine, but also from any help that Western Ukraine and NATO could give to Ukraine because the government is in Kiev. So these are just the various scenarios that we've kind of seen, but it all comes from using these two regions in the far east of Ukraine to, further engage militarily with Ukraine. If any of that makes sense, it helps a lot if you're looking at a map.
I'm really confused by President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, his
Mhm.
responses here, just from the beginning, right? Like I remember, a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was just a week ago, when he was reportedly kind of unhappy with the way that the West, and particularly, America, President Biden, was talking about, this conflict, right? He wanted us to kind of
Mhm.
tamp down the rhetoric, and I guess he was afraid that we would cause a panic, right? And
Hmm.
then after Putin's statements, the address about these two regions, which happened, like the other day, he sounded alarmed when he addressed his nation, which, he should have probably been. But then late
Hmm.
yesterday evening, it sounded like he was walking back those statements, saying that, Russia had a legal right to protect those regions. Like, I don't, what is he doing exactly?
So Zelensky, his address to the Ukrainian people that happened super late last night, like I listened to it in Ukrainian, and it was very strong. It was very much he is trying to lead the country, but also deal with the fact that this is a major incursion on Ukrainian sovereignty. And I think there are two things about Zelensky. He is very, wet behind the ears when it comes to politics. He's very fresh. He's still very new to this.
He's the
And
president.
consider, yeah,
Sorry.
he's the president, but he's also like new, like he was a comedian like 3 years
Oh, yeah,
ago.
that's
So
right.
he's
Okay.
so he's new to this. So I think in being new to anything, but also being new, and then you're dealing with like the Russian military. And I think the key problem is, especially for a lot of Western media outlets, in how Zelensky talks about the situation, is they forget that Ukraine's been under Russian like invasion shadow for 8 years now. Russia has been playing around in eastern Ukraine for 8 years. They've kind of always had to worry about this. Russia has done major disinformation and cyber attacks in Ukraine. It cut off the power a couple of years ago. It shut down banks. So this is something Ukraine has been dealing with for 8 years. And so understanding that, his responses make more sense. He's also trying very hard to keep people in Ukraine calm. You don't want to run on any of the banks. You don't want people out crisis buying, especially when Ukraine's also being ravaged by COVID-19. So he's kind of dealing with these two dual crises. Um, and sometimes he puts his foot in his mouth. Yes. I mean, we are also under President Joseph Robinette Biden, who is famous for putting his foot in his mouth.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So, like I try to give him a little bit more credit for that. But I have noticed there's an incident last week or a couple of weeks ago where Western media sources just simply mistranslated what he said. I guess February 16th, he wanted to have a day of unity for Ukraine. And he said, and the construction in Ukrainian is very clear, they have threatened us with war. But if you don't read Ukrainian or Russian, you don't understand this construction. And it became no, they thought he said, we are afraid and threatened by war.
Right.
So they thought this was this crisis message. And like, I think CNN and the BBC kind of ran with this. And all of us who like speak and read Ukrainian were like, yeah, that's not what he said. And then the next headline was he walked back his comments. It's like he didn't walk back his comments. He never made the first comment. Right. So
I see.
I think
Okay.
it's really hard because sometimes you're just like, bro, what are you talking about? And then sometimes I'm like, okay, I get it. You're being presidential. And so, yeah, it's hard. But I try to give him more credit than not because he just isn't as good at this as like Putin is. But Putin's had like over 20 years of
Right.
practice.
Right. Yeah. And I was talking to someone about this the other day, and I was saying, they are a democracy. They're, a sovereign nation. They have free elections, and they're right next to
Hmm.
Russia. So, like, can you imagine if instead of Canada, like Russia was above us,
Yeah, it
right?
would be
Like,
very different.
that- yeah, it'd be very different. And I could imagine like being kind of a newer president and having to deal with that. I don't know. It's very concerning. So one of the things that's been bothering me about this invasion of Ukraine is that why now, right? We had
Hmm.
4 years of a U.S. administration that was sympathetic, for lack of a better word, to Putin's worldview and anything that he'd do, but they chose to act. Now when we have a president who is clearly, not sympathetic to Putin's point of view. So why? Like, why? What do you make of Putin's timing here?
This has been like the key question. It's like, why now? I think
Yeah.
I think there's a few things that go into this. The COVID-19 crisis that is still like ravaging Russia and ravaging Ukraine. Putin seeing Zelensky as a weak leader is key, but also like the recent administration change in Germany from Merkel to Schultz. Merkel is a known entity to Putin. Schultz wasn't. So he may have thought, the way Schultz would respond would be different than the way Schultz has responded with killing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I think the Olympics, because that has international attention. Also, the timing of Congress's recess. So I think there are a lot of factors that go into it. But I also don't think this was a spur of the moment decision. I think this has been cooking for a long time. But and really, I mean, we don't know. I have no idea what made Putin decide this was the time. I can just kind of give some ideas of what could have been. But this has just been the question for a lot of us who work on the region. It's like, why now? And why in this way?
Right. I mean, perhaps. I mean, this is a long shot, but perhaps he also expected Trump to win again, right? I don't
Because
know.
yeah, I'm like, if anything, if he was going to do anything, January 6th would have been the day to like
Yeah.
while America's dealing with all this stuff, it would have been the
Right.
perfect time because Russia already had a significant amount of troops in Ukraine. But yeah, I think it's really just curious. For and it's also like, yeah, if he did it during the Trump administration, what this terrifying thing is, how would Trump have responded? That's what would keep me up at night, honestly,
Right.
thinking
I mean,
about that.
yeah, he would have. I mean, yeah, he wouldn't have done anything, advantageous for Ukraine. That's for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the other thing that I've been worried about are these, and you mentioned this before about these Russian hacks to Ukraine's power grid. And when Trump was in office, they also, hacked America's power grid here, right? And also into our tech companies. I
Hmm.
don't think anything's happened since then. I don't know what's happening, if anyone's investigating that, or if there's a link to what's happening now. Should we be afraid of that as some kind of retaliatory measure if we impose sanctions?
I think I'm less concerned about like Russian cyber attacks on the American front than them doing this to Ukraine. I think all of Russia's firepower, but literally and in terms of cyber terrorism, will be focused on Ukraine. Um, so I'm less concerned about that than like the way it would help a further Russian intent in Ukraine. So I'm not as concerned about that. But I mean, I could always be wrong because the situation is moving so quickly. But also, it just seems like Putin's behaving more and more erratically than he used to, which is
Right.
kind of scary right now.
Right. And, someone made this comment. I don't know if it was Timothy Snyder or, he wrote the book Tyranny, I believe.
Hmm.
Someone made the point recently that people think that Putin's playing chess.
No.
And he's not really. And I don't know where that, that idea of him came from, but he's probably not playing chess. He's, I was saying this the other day that, he's just as erratic sometimes as Trump, right?
The last thing I can say about Putin is get rid of this idea that Putin is playing like 3D chess or that he's the ultimate Bond villain or like this superhuman, all knowing KGB agent. None of that is correct.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And it's just not helpful.
Kimberly, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for taking the time to explain all of this to me. And thank you for writing that really powerful essay. I'll put the link to it in the show notes. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been great.